If you step outside of the American bubble and look at East Asia, one thing really shows up. Not culture wars, not ideology, not media narratives. Numbers. And not just any numbers, birth rate numbers and population numbers. This topic began to pique my interest after the fallout from the US presidential election. Namely, how many American women claimed that they were going to join South Korean women in following the 4B movement, or the 4 No's movement, saying no to dating, marriage, relations, and childbirth. However, when it comes to population numbers and population collapse, people have been giving warnings about this since 1996. And well, these countries, even China, are some of the most wealthy societies in the entire world and had some of the fastest turnarounds in world history, going from farming to huge mega industrial centers in a generation. So are current East Asian societies in the process of declining or disappearing? Or are the demographics overblown and pushed by conservative and religious movements? Hey guys, I'm your host Dylan, and today my goal isn't to rank one culture or society as superior to the other, but to objectively look at the facts for something so important to society. I'll look at the research, the data, and the statistics while keeping my biases out as much as possible. First, I'll look at what the numbers really say in context, then what the future beholds, then the reasons behind it all, then what countries are trying to do to stop this, and are they working? And as is a tradition on this channel, if you catch any mistakes in making this video, leave a comment and I'll correct myself in the pinned comment below. But first, we need to hear about the one rule that governs all population math. Regardless of culture, regardless of politics, to sustain a population without immigration, a society needs to have a total fertility rate above 2.1 children per woman. To not keep you waiting, every single major East Asian country is far below this number. The most striking example is South Korea, which holds the unfortunate world record for the lowest fertility rate in the world, hitting 0.72 in 2023, and projected to drop even further, meaning for every 6 people in Korea, about 2 kids are born. China's situation is even more striking when viewed historically. In the mid-20th century, Chinese women averaged more than 6 children. That number collapsed after the 1970s and has continued falling ever since. Today, China's fertility rate hovers around 1 child per woman. And the consequences of this is not abstract. China's population has begun shrinking in absolute terms, losing tens of millions of people in just a few years. Annual births have fallen to levels not seen since the 1700s, back when the entire world population was 610 million people. Less than half of what China's is alone today. When we look at Japan, birth rates fell below 700,000 for the first time in 2024. And from its high point of 128.5 million people in 2010, its current population is 123 million. That's what happens when your fertility rate is 1.3 and stays around that for decades. Okay, not great, but there's one last thing we have to answer before we can move on. Who is Asian? I know, probably not the question you're expecting to be answered in this video, but it's pretty important when making a video about Asian societies. And also feels like it should have an easy answer given there's an entire continent named Asia. But if only it was that simple. If named geographically, Asians would include China, Thailand, India, parts of Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkmenistan. That's not an exhaustive list, but these places are so far apart and so different that the shared identity with the word Asian wouldn't be much greater than the identity of human. So instead, we're going to go by American definitions of Asian, which refers to East Asians, which includes China, Japan, the Koreas, plural, and Taiwan, if you believe it's an independent state. Now, one thing you might be thinking about is, Asian immigrants in other countries. And don't worry, they'll be talked about a little bit later. But each and every one of these places have deeply tied together writing, language, philosophy, and social values between one another. And every one of them have a declining population. So now that we have our numbers straight and our definitions set, what does the future hold for East Asian countries? Are Asians going to disappear? Well, put bluntly, if current trends continue, the sheer scale of the population loss is going to be staggering. Japan, from now to 2100, would go from a population of 124 million to 60 million. a 50% decrease. China from now to 2100 would go from 1.4 billion people, the second largest country in the world, to 633 million people. A 60% decrease that wouldn't put them much further ahead than the US. South Korea from now to 2100 would go from 51 million people to 17 million people, a 70% decrease. That's astonishing. Taiwan would go from 23.4 million to 10 million, a 57% decrease in the same span. And North Korea would have the smallest decline because a lot of their population don't have rights, so they just have kids. So they would go from 26 million to around 20 million. A 20% decline. For comparison, the US is gaining somewhere around 15% of its total population from now until 2100. So they go from roughly 333 million to about 380. However, these numbers are highly dependent on what immigration over the next 75 years look like, as you can see with the graphs on screen. But you know, speaking of immigration, I now have to speak of all the East Asians, even the ones outside of East Asia. And well, their birth numbers do look better. Koreans outside of South Korea have a birth rate around 1.2, which isn't great, but compared to 0.72 is quite an upgrade. Chinese outside of China average a birth rate higher than those in China. We don't have the exact numbers, but one study found that it was higher. And another source found that US-born Asians as a group have a birth rate of 1.53, much higher than any other past home countries. So while technically disappearing in the same way that their numbers are lower than the necessary 2.1 for replacement, these groups track much more closely to other developed countries like those in Europe and the United States. But here's the part I was waiting to talk about, because I feel like I've never heard anyone talk about it, and it's probably because it's an uncomfortable topic, but that's racial assimilation. So I know, I really do. How bad that sounds. But it's not some Nazi-esque thing tied to ideology and death. It's just looking at what the numbers show. Just hear me out before you get some bad opinions about me. Asian immigrants are the fastest growing group, identifying themselves as 2 or more races on the census. That might be due to the fact that around 30% of foreign-born Asian newlyweds in the US intermarry. And unsurprisingly, Asian women are much more likely to intermarry, adding a little bit to the white man and Asian women trope, as you can see on the graph. And for the simple fact that there are less Asians than whites, blacks, and Hispanics, as generations continue, if interracial marriage rates continue to rise, over time their descendants are going to be more and more likely to identify with another race. Most likely white because of the sheer numbers compared to everyone else and the current racial intermarry rate. Now, it's important to note that this isn't for some freaky eugenics reason. I mean, there might be some weird people that purposely marry an Asian woman, for example, in order to make the Asians white. But other than freak examples like that, it's just people choosing to do what they want to do out of their own free volition. But alright, now that you probably dislike me a little bit, let's move on to the reasons. Because what's going on here? Across the whole world, people are having less and less kids. But what on earth is leading to East Asians having way less than everyone else? Well, there's no real consensus. The answer you give is largely defined by your political identity. So let's just take a look at the most common reasons given, and you can make up your own mind. One of the clearest patterns across East Asian societies is the widening gap between men and women politically and culturally. Young women in these societies are becoming more socially liberal, and young men, by contrast, are not moving at the same pace. In some cases, they are drifting in the opposite direction. This divergence matters because family formation requires at least some degree of alignment. Marriage and children depend on shared expectations about work, sacrifice, gender roles, and what the future plans are. When those expectations no longer overlap, relationships just become harder. They stop forming altogether. For a more American-centric example, 50% of Trump voters and 70% of Clinton voters in the 2016 election said they would not date someone who voted for the other candidate. Now, are a lot of these people just being emotional in the moment, and once they actually got to know someone, make it an exception? Probably. But it still does show something about shared expectations. South Korea is the most visible example. Surveys show young men and women holding sharply different views on feminism, work expectations, marriage, and even whether the opposite sex can be trusted. Dating has become so adversarial that the, as aforementioned, 4B movement is a real popular thing, and not just a little trend after the election like you hear was in the States. And with this, marriage becomes unattractive and parenthood becomes unthinkable. And unlike earlier generations, there is no strong cultural presence left to force reconciliation. In previous generations, there was really strong social pressure. Now, people simply opt out. Another thing to consider is that for most of human history, societies relied on informal but powerful social scripts. Enlightenment thinkers call this the social contract. You finish school, you get a job, you married someone from your community, you had children. The order wasn't exact and things could vary, but the destination was pretty clear for everyone. In East Asia, those scripts have fractured without a real replacement being presented. Traditional ideas about marriage are non-existent. That creates issues. For example, through Japan's golden years, the standard family was a man who worked 60 to 80 hours a week, 6 days a week, for the same employer from graduation to retirement, while the woman raised the family as one could say a single mother with a deadbeat dad, but a little more than that. It still wasn't great from our Western lens, and this was virtually the same case in Korea, and currently somewhat happening in China with the 996. Now, the system falling apart isn't inherently bad. The previous system did lead to immense levels of heart attacks in men, stroke, and suicide. And there's been many other societies where traditional ideas about family structures have been falling apart, like in the US. But importantly, these societies don't accept alternative family structures, like polyamory or children out of wedlock, with having children outside of marriage being incredibly rare to this day. Single parenthood is stigmatized, and cohabitation without marriage often lacks legal and social support. Most don't buy into the traditional marriage system, but there is no widely accepted alternative, except nothing. The effects are clear. Only 50% of 20-year-old Japanese have ever been on a date, ever. And around 25% for both genders of that age are in a relationship. Around 60% of Koreans are not in a relationship, with 40% giving up on dating altogether. And while China's hard to get statistics from because of the CCP, but one survey found 50% of college students reported no desire to fall in love. So when the traditional path breaks and there's no backup path, there's just an exit. The social contract is broke. And when you tie this in with the crazy cost of living in East Asia, then you get a real bad situation. Because in South Korea, nearly half the population lives in the Seoul metropolitan area. In Japan, Tokyo dominates economic life with a near majority of the population living in the expanded metro area. And in China, the best jobs cluster in a handful of megacities. Housing in these areas are exorbitant. And if you think LA is bad or New York City, you haven't seen anything like East Asians. So you have to work all the time in order to have a house, and cities are known to produce lower birth rates than suburban or rural areas. And especially in China, when having a home is often treated as a prerequisite for marriage, especially for men, due to there being millions of more men in China than women due to the misogyny during the one-child policy, dating and reproducing just becomes even more difficult. The cost of finance and time and education just adds another layer too. In East Asian countries, as a parent, you're expected to give your child a lot of private tutoring. And after they're done tutoring, it's your job to tutor them with homework and get them even better at school. It's a system where if you don't give your kid another 4 to 5 hours of schooling after school, you're failing them. It's like the system in the US where you feel like you're a failing parent if your kid isn't in a rec soccer league, but on steroids. And when every child represents a massive financial, emotional, and time-consuming investment, many people are just less ecstatic and ready to have kids. You could see that as selfishness, but it's often just realism. But there is also a general decrease in desire to have children in these countries. Only 65% of Korean women intend to marry, and an astronomically low 35% of Korean women that don't have a kid intend to have a child. And there's a similar story in Japan with only 37% saying they definitely want a child. And when comparing these numbers to the US numbers, you can see the stark difference, with 60% of women who don't have kids in the US saying they plan and want to have kids. So with all this said, having a declining population by 50% over the next 70 years is not good for a society. So what are countries trying to do to reverse these trends? Well, no one is really working on stopping interracial marriage in the US. That's something that we just don't do here anymore. Definitely a good thing. But there are East Asian countries trying to do everything they can to increase their populations and stop this downhill trajectory even to just flatten the curve. They are doing everything they can. In Japan, starting in April 2026, the government is implementing a new child and child rearing support contribution scheme. It doubles monthly allowances for third children to 30,000 yen, which is about $200, and extends eligibility through high school. So $200 a month for 18 years for a third child. Expecting mothers in Japan can take a total of 14 weeks of maternity leave, 6 weeks before the estimated due date and 8 weeks after giving birth. However, after maternity leave ends, you can take additional transition time, which allows you to take time off of work until the child turns 1 year old. During this time, the employees will get approximately 2/3 of their base salary, typically paid by the government-sponsored social insurance. And for men, you can take up to 8 weeks leave following the child's birth. However, restrictions do apply more for men. Employees have to work for a company for at least 1 year, and employees must provide their employers with a birth certificate. In South Korea, the government programs are a lot easier to explain than Japan's. The country offers monthly parental leave of up to 1 million won, or $750 for infants, and paid leave is allowed up until 18 months. 80% of the pay for the first 3 months and 50% thereafter. For China, in 2025, the government implemented its first unified national childcare subsidy, offering 3,600 won annually for children under 3. Some local provinces offer even higher one-time birth grants. Maternity leave is set to be 98 days, according to the federal government, but each province expands this amount from anywhere between 128 to 190 days. Most working fathers in China can take maternity leave if they meet certain eligibility criteria, though the duration varies by region, but on average is around 15 days. The criteria includes that the fathers have to present their child's birth certificate and may have to submit additional documents to prove that they are the father. They must be legally married, they should have been employed by their current employer for at least 1 year, and they must have some sort of agreement that allows them to take the leave. A few more just interesting things that the governments are attempting to do to reverse the course is realizing that people aren't even getting to the marriage stage. So they're stepping in as matchmakers. Tokyo has released its own AI-powered dating app, Tokyo Emusabi, which requires users to submit a certificate of single status and proof of income to ensure trust. And in South Korea, Seoul organizes large-scale dating festivals where they offer dating coupons, which are just cash subsidies, to couples who successfully match at these events to help cover the cost of their first few dates. And in China, the government has started a propaganda campaign for positive views on marriage through state media, framing marriage and childbearing not just as a personal choice, but as a necessary contribution to society. They also want to drastically reduce the cost of childbirth, with IVF in Taiwan and Japan now offering significant subsidies for women to freeze their eggs. In Taiwan, the government will cover up to 77% of the IVF costs. And recently, China announced it as a goal to make standard hospital childbirth completely free nationwide by the end of 2026. And while all of these seem fun and helpful towards the problem, what sounds good in theory doesn't always line up with real world results. So is any of this actually working? Maybe a little bit, maybe a little bit. When looking at the most recent data from 2025 and early 2026, the results are a mixed bag of slight hope and continued free fall. In South Korea, we actually saw a surprise. After years of record low, births in 2025 rose by about 6.5%. This was the first significant rebound in population in almost a decade. This has largely been attributed to the post-pandemic marriage boom and the fact that the government's massive cash injections, likely the $750 monthly of parent pay, are finally making a dent for the middle-class families to afford kids. The government is now optimistically projecting the fertility rate to recover to about 0.9 by the end of 2026. Still in crazy danger zone, but is moving in the right direction. But then you look at China and Japan, and the picture darkens. Despite the new subsidies and the Year of the Dragon, which is usually a lucky year for births according to Chinese tradition, births in 2025 plummeted to 7.92 million. The lowest since the 1700s. The 13% condom tax and matchmaking efforts haven't been able to overcome the 996 work culture, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, which is attributed as the reason that many Chinese struggle to have a personal life. In Japan, the numbers here continue to break record lows. Preliminary data for 2025 suggests births will fall below 670,000, a level demographers didn't expect to see until 2040. But honestly, besides Korea, these are results that most people expected, because Eastern European countries have been going through the same thing. They have these huge incentives for people to have kids, but oftentimes it just doesn't do anything, and it just gives money to existing parental families who already made a decision that they don't want any more kids, or already made the decision that they wanted to have kids. This is why many argue against what many people will say in internet interviews, is that cost isn't the biggest reason people don't have kids. Otherwise, Luxembourg would have a fertility of 6 and South Sudan would have a fertility of 5. Even in the US, across most of history, income correlates negatively with fertility rate. So why aren't billions of dollars in subsidies working everywhere? Because you can't buy a baby if the person doesn't have the desire to have one. Critics argue that the economic health isn't doing anything because the structure of society fails to give people the desire to have kids. We talked about interracial marriage a decent amount here today because it's big for Asian immigrants. But I've looked at it separately when looking into a stereotype you're not supposed to mention: Black athletes and sports. What's the full story here? Is it just a stereotype that people use to give excuses, or is there something actually behind it? You can check out that video right here. And don't forget to not believe in eugenics, have kids for society's sake if you're East Asian, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.